Welcome, everyone. My name is Dave Feldman. I'm a political scientist with the Department of Planning, Policy, and Design in the School of Social Ecology here at the University of California, Irvine. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this presentation on governance issues for low-impact development, lessons from the U.S. and Australia. What we want to do today is first provide an overview of what we mean by governance. You've been listening to a lot of presentations and learning a lot about the technical aspects of low-impact development, the scientific basis, the biological advantages, the engineering characteristics. And what we're going to do today is to talk about the social and policy impacts and implications of low-impact development. Governance, which is an area I work in, is the process of solving problems through the use of law, regulation, and collaboration among different sectors of society. Now, for low-impact development, governance establishes and also enforces things such as acceptable levels of human health risk and environmental risk, and it introduces programs to reduce or remove contaminants from the water environment. Governance also encompasses urban planning, which is a process for creating more convenient, equitable, healthful, efficient, and attractive places for present and future generations. And as you've probably already learned, one of the advantages of low-impact development is to beautify environments by allowing drought-tolerant landscaping and basically ways of capturing stormwater and using it in useful ways. Australia and the U.S., which I'm going to spend most of my time talking about today, provide very important lessons for land use and water planning as means of implementing low-impact developments. Australia's had relatively much experience with low-impact development. The United States, not so much, but we can both learn from one another's experiences. In understanding governance, it's important to understand that governance is comprised of three basic elements, which we call process, power, and purpose. And these three elements working together provide a framework for understanding what we need to do if we're going to actually implement low-impact development in various communities around the United States, including right here in Southern California. Let's take a look at these three elements so we can understand them in a little more detail. Process refers to the way in which decisions are made. And basically, for low-impact development, as for pretty much everything in the water field, process employs an interplay of agencies and non-governmental organizations in decision-making. It's a very fragmented process. Some might even say a confusing process. Certainly, it seems to be that way even for political scientists. It's also very much driven by an agenda. For example, some of the entities that are involved in this process are engaged in regulation, setting standards for public safety and health. Some want to promote water uses and technologies. Maybe they're introducing a particular type of low-impact development that they feel needs the favor of governmental support, perhaps even subsidies, in order to be introduced. We gauge this notion of process through what we call a forensic analysis of decision-making. And much of what you're going to be learning today about governance and low-impact development is based on investigations we've done in PIRE and that other investigators have done in Australia, US, and elsewhere on looking at how it is that low-impact development came to be actually implemented and established in communities. These are case studies, and we call this backward-looking reconstructive analysis forensic analysis. Low-impact developments also have a purpose. And one of the interesting things from a governance standpoint is because you have so many different participants that are promoting or regulating or otherwise involved in low-impact development, is that these purposes may in fact consist of conflicting goals that are held by various protagonists. For example, Should we adopt a particular low-impact development to maximize the protection of the environment, or in other words, ecological resources? That's certainly one point of view. It's an important one. Some might say, however, that the primary consideration, the primary purpose in low-impact development is to add to the real estate value and the taxable value of properties in, say, residential and commercial communities. So they might say, well, it's really about maximizing economic growth and development. And there's even an approach that says, well, if this is going to be funded by taxpayer money, then what we need to do is to minimize the cost to the ultimate users and to the taxpayers who are paying for it. Now, we gauge these conflicting goals, we measure their intensity and their importance in governance through things like public opinion surveys and polls of public attitudes. We can also use case studies, as we did when we looked at process, to try to reconstruct the policy history of various low-impact developments and to see what sorts of goals were most important. And this is all important because if we're going to implement low-impact developments in various communities, we want to understand how other communities have experienced the implementation of low-impact development so we can learn from them. Finally, as a political scientist, it's very important to note that low-impact development, like any publicly sponsored decision regarding water and the environment, also depends on power, which is the relative ability of various people to determine the outcomes of any policy. And one of the things we know about low-impact development is that the ability to determine these outcomes is really shared among many different parties in communities. Between environmental and economic interests, think back to the previous discussion on purpose. Environmental groups may have somewhat different interests than economic groups, and they may also hold different power at the table of deciding how and if low-impact developments are going to be instituted in communities. We're going to see a couple of examples of this. There can also be relative power differences between regions. In both the United States and Australia, the power to regulate water quality, the power to regulate the implementation of low-impact development is shared by different governmental levels: cities, states, and the national government. So the relative power between regions is very important in understanding low-impact development's governance. And between the various functions that low-impact development can serve. Is it primarily for the benefit of municipal areas, or in other words, cities? Or is it primarily to capture stormwater and other sources of water for the use of agriculture? As we know here in California, for example, these different uses of water in other sectors have often been at odds. And in fact, the relative power of various interests to determine how a particular technology or approach will be used is just as important in low-impact development as it is in other areas of water policy. Now, how do we look at power? How do we examine its importance? Well, again, we look at case studies, and then we triangulate the different types of evidence that we see across cases to see what sorts of groups and interests and sectors wielded more power and authority in determining outcomes and which ones yielded less. I want to talk a little bit about the governance of low-impact developments as a baseline for understanding how things are done in both Australia and the United States. And I want to start by saying that one of the interesting things about these two countries is that they do have a lot of commonalities in how they govern low-impact development, but at the same time, they're also differentiated in the emphasis they give to different levels of governance. Let's start with Australia. In Australia, states and territorial governance have the overall authority for land and water use. What this means is that organizations such as catchment management trusts, what we in the United States would call watershed management authorities, and the boards that manage these catchment trusts have the primary responsibility for preparing water resource plans, for undertaking public works, and for involving various members of the community in decisions. And it is very important in Australia that community participation be encouraged. Localities, or in other words, municipal and local governance, are supposed to embrace management guidelines that are established by federal and state policies. And what this simply means is that localities will ultimately implement low-impact developments, as they will other water resource management alternatives, but they have to do so within this broad framework of guidelines that are established by federal policies set by the government in Canberra and by their state governance. In the United States, federal regulations set stormwater regulations on such things as how federal agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency or the Army Corps of Engineers or other agencies involved in water will actually conduct planning. These federal regulations also influence site development and construction activities, which are now under Executive Order 13514, actually determines how construction activities have to minimize flood levels and also minimize pollution to various waterways. Furthermore, the Clean Water Act, which has been amended by the U.S. Congress on several occasions, has a complicated system called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, the purpose of which is to regulate discharges from such things as municipal storm sewer systems, also known as MS4s, from construction sites, such as the building of roadways or shopping centers or commercial areas or even residential subdivisions, industrial activities, and what we call point source wastewater discharges, such as wastewater treatment plants or various industrial sources. This gives the U.S. federal government great power in setting overall regulations as we move toward looking at ways of regulating stormwater and thus ways of considering the appropriateness of low-impact development in various communities. All right, these illustrations on this slide show some of the stormwater challenges that necessitate consideration of low-impact development in various communities. At the top, you see a couple of figures that are centered on Port Phillip Bay, which is the major estuary adjacent to the city of Melbourne, Victoria. At the bottom is the estuary for the Los Angeles River. Now, let's start with the top. Port Phillip Bay, which again is the estuary for Melbourne, is the endpoint for stormwater as well as wastewater treatment discharges that emanate from this metropolitan area of some 4.5 million people. On the right, you'll notice that one of the primary means of controlling waste streams is literally voluntary use of litter source controls. And you find these throughout the Port Phillip Bay region in Melbourne, as you do in many other cities around the world. And the significance of this is that a lot of the way in which we control wastewater discharges is not only through large technological means, but through individual efforts at keeping our beaches and our waterways clean. At the bottom, in Los Angeles, you see the same problem. And very dramatically, at the mouth of the Los Angeles River, you see what happens after a major storm event. Your eyes do not deceive you. This is massive amounts of trash. Everything from household litter to shopping carts to tires to plastics that simply accumulate at the mouth of the Los Angeles River and have to be removed by a crane and then landfilled. This is precisely what low-impact developments are designed to try to alleviate. Let's look a little bit about stormwater governance in Victoria, which is in southeastern Australia. Several years ago, Australia as a whole, in particular southeastern Australia, underwent a very, very severe drought. A drought that was so severe it was given the name of the Millennium Drought. A lot of innovations were adopted during this drought, both to alleviate water quality problems, but also to make appropriate use of every available drop of water when it did rain. One of those innovations was the adoption by local governments of what are called development consents. Think of a development consent as a zoning code. Essentially, it was a legal ordinance that encouraged the adoption of rainwater tanks that would be connected to household and commercial roofs and that would collect rainwater that could then be used for gardens, even for toilet flushing, for washing clothes, and for washing vehicles. The idea here is that you would not necessarily use this water, in fact, you really shouldn't use this water for drinking or potable use, but it's quite safe for these other applications. And in the process, you're actually not only putting stormwater to a constructive use, but you're conserving precious drinking water. Another innovation that was adopted was the use of above as well as underground stormwater storage vehicles, often called on-site detention. These could be either ponds or large underground tanks. Now, in order to adopt these innovations, incentives were given to developers, the people that would actually build or modify real estate, real property, as well as individual homeowners to adopt these innovations. And those innovations included such things as rebates, essentially reduced charges on your water and sewer bills if you adopted these innovations. The idea being that you use not only regulatory means of enforcing standards to encourage the adoption of low-impact development, but you use the carrot, or in other words, an economic inducement to get people to see the practical value of these approaches. This is an example of a constructed wetland that was established in a park in Melbourne, Australia. This constructed wetland serves many purposes. During rain events, it collects the rainwater and keeps it out of waterways. In addition, that water attracts wildlife, in particular, various birds. Thirdly, it keeps flood levels at a lower stage. And last but not least, it can replenish the water supply in this local area, both by recharging the groundwater basin and more especially providing water supply for these native plants in this park. So it's recreational, it's environmentally important, it attenuates or reduces flood flows, and it looks pretty nice as well. You'll notice on the left a little figure. This is something that was produced by Melbourne Water, major water utility in the city of Melbourne, and it really underscores the significance of these kinds of development. Essentially, that more rain falls on Melbourne than is stored in the various dams and water projects around the city. That really drives the point home that low-impact development can be a tremendously constructive means of augmenting water supply and of addressing a lot of water resource needs. For Melbourne, we call these stormwater reuse schemes low energy because another thing that such vehicles as this constructive wetland serve is to keep water out of wastewater treatment systems, which have to employ vast amounts of energy to treat water and then put it back into the environment. This is a way of capturing water before it's contaminated and relying on processes that don't use much energy to remove the contaminants. In fact, you can take this water, and if you wanted to make it into a potable supply, you could then divert this water to a drinking water treatment plant and treat it only to the extent needed for the intended end use. This is one of the beauties of this. This water is not wasted. It's not going to simply go into Port Phillip Bay. A lot of the contaminants will settle out right here in this wetland, and the remaining water can be easily treated for other purposes. Stormwater wetlands and biofiltration are effective means of treating stormwater for non-potable uses, as well as for pretreatment for a further level of treatment that will in fact allow water such as these to be used for potable purposes. Let's turn to Southern California for a moment and look at some of the contrasts as well as comparisons. A few years ago, the city of Los Angeles adopted its first ever low-impact development ordinance. And it is an ordinance that applies to all businesses, most but not all residences. And the idea behind this low-impact ordinance is to reduce impervious surface throughout the city. One of the interesting things about this low-impact development ordinance is that it was established through a cooperative process. Remember, we talked about process, power, and purpose momentarily. Well, here's an example. This was a law that was established by working with neighborhoods, by working with a variety of environmental, non-governmental organizations, by business groups, and by the building industry to come up with a law that could be implemented, that could serve a number of good environmental and economic purposes, and also get the buy-in of a number of vital players to make low-impact development workable. The law mandates the adoption of some form of low-impact development for virtually all new or renovated buildings. But here's the real interesting part of this governance innovation. Because it was established in collaboration with all of these various entities, it emphasizes the choice of innovation to be adopted. So instead of the city telling builders and homeowners and neighborhood groups what kind of low-impact development has to be instituted, it leaves it up to these various groups to select from an array of possible low-impact developments that best fit the end uses, that best fit the character of the community, and that are most thought to be affordable and easily maintained. Redevelopment projects under this low-impact development ordinance have to do a number of things. Again, the way they do them is up to the builders and the developers and the homeowners. But the idea is that the redevelopment projects will capture rainwater at its source through utilizing such vehicles as rain barrels, as they do in Australia, through the use of permeable pavements, through various storage tanks and ponds, and through another innovation called infiltration swales. The benefits are numerous. Water conservation. Again, as in Australia, by capturing stormwater, you're not letting it simply go out to sea. You're using it for an environmental purpose, or really an array of environmental purposes, which then allows you to conserve precious drinking water. You can also recharge groundwater, and you can green up neighborhoods in very beautiful ways. As these illustrations show, at the top, rain barrels in a residential development in the San Fernando Valley, and at the bottom, a rain garden. Native vegetation that can be supported by stormwater, not only the stormwater that falls immediately, but that can be stored over time in rain barrels. So, Los Angeles, is one community that is quite aggressively pursuing low-impact development. Orange County, where I'm speaking to you right now, is another area that is very seriously contemplating adopting low-impact developments of various sorts. A question that comes up when we talk about governance and low-impact development is the potential for stormwater capture. Before we decide that we should do this, before we get people together to sit around a table and develop a process for actually implementing low-impact development, and before we decide on a purpose, we need to know something about the potential of stormwater capture in our region. This is a map of California, of course, which shows the potential for stormwater capture in various regions. Interestingly, and perhaps for many of us, a quite illuminating fact is that the South Coast, where we live, actually has the highest potential of any region in California for capturing stormwater and for putting it into urban efficient uses. Neighborhood level best management practices that include things such as rooftop capture, green roofs, garden roofs, rain barrels, various rain gardens are the most efficient methods that could be used in our region. Many water agencies here in Southern California anticipate over time that there will be a greater use of stormwater capture, what is often called harvesting of rainwater. But as we know, and as we've seen in our discussion of governance issues, land use and regulatory issues have to be confronted and have to be managed if these innovations are going to be adopted. These land use and regulatory issues make adoption a relatively slow process, and that can prove to be very frustrating. It shouldn't be frustrating if we bear in mind one fact. In a democratic society, such as the United States or Australia, the process of decision-making is complex, and it's designed to be so in order to capture the interests of many voices. Likewise, power is shared, and that ensures that no one gets everything they want, but everybody gets to share the benefits as well as the costs. And the purpose is varied. Obviously, this is going to make decisions seemingly slow, but in the long run, it will also make those decisions durable, long-lasting, and more than likely publicly acceptable. A moment ago, I said that this process of making decisions for low-impact development is going to be slow and perhaps, in the eyes of some, cumbersome. But let's look for a moment at how Victoria, Australia, actually put into practice various principles for the reuse of rainwater as well as other water streams that we're going to look at momentarily. During the Millennium Drought, the state of Victoria adopted a set of principles for the capture and reuse not only of rainwater and stormwater, but of two other water streams. One is called gray water, and this is the water that goes down sinks, also goes down in washing machines, for example, and dishwashers. It's partly contaminated. You wouldn't want to drink it, but you know, you can use it in gardens, and you can reuse it for a variety of purposes around the house. Sewage is obviously what we call black water, and this is something that usually has to be treated in some means before it can be reused. The idea here was to try to figure out how these various sources of water could be combined in some way to manage urban water needs in a city like Melbourne. And what was determined under these principles that were adopted is that starting with rainwater, you actually have sources of water that have very, very little risk to the public's health or well-being. They also don't need a lot of energy inputs to make them ready for reuse. As you go down this figure, however, things like gray water and sewage do pose potentially high risks to human health and to the environment. So they're going to have to be treated in some way before we can put them into valuable uses. And that means that we're going to have to apply some degree of energy inputs or energy consumption to make them usable. Some sources, as you can see on the right, such as rainwater and stormwater, can often be used directly without any treatment for purposes where there's a low likelihood of human contact or human ingestion. But as you go down this chart, you'll see that some sources will typically require treatment before they can be used. The idea behind this set of principles was to help Australian communities figure out how they could rank risks for alternative water sources. And the end result was that the state of Victoria came up with a set of regulations that essentially encourages gradations of water quality for different uses. So you can have a stormwater capture system, what we've been calling low-impact development, that can take rainwater and stormwater and use it for a variety of purposes right off the bat with very little or even no treatment. On the other hand, for some end uses, such as gray water and sewage reuse, you're going to have to treat those sources of water before they can be used. And even then, you're probably not going to put those water sources on gardens or on crops, but you may be able to treat them to certain levels where they could be used for industrial cooling, for example, or some commercial applications of water. Now, what's really interesting about this is the Australian government in Canberra grants wide latitude to states such as Victoria in setting the risk standards for these various end uses. That encourages a more decentralized, a more entrepreneurial set of approaches when you actually adopt low-impact developments, or for that matter, when you adopt any set of water innovations to deal with precious water supply issues. We want to turn now to the issue of public acceptance in stormwater use. One of the things that's been implied in my presentation is that the role of the public in accepting the various risks, the costs, as well as the benefits of stormwater use is going to be a very important set of factors when we consider the adoption of low-impact development. In Australia, there's been a great deal of social science research over the past decade. And this research has shown that while the public recognizes the potential of stormwater as an alternative source of water supply, there are some concerns that the public harbors. For example, the perceptions of health risk are closely related to the proximity of end use to human contact. Simple way of translating this is that the more likely it is that stormwater is going to be used for human ingestion, the more likely it is that the public is going to want very, very stringent regulations in how this stormwater is reused and how it's treated. Another finding is that the public more strongly prefers stormwater uses that in the long run will have limited human contact. In this way, you can guarantee quality and you can assure that the uses will be non-potable. To carry out some of the lessons of that social science research, the City of Melbourne has developed an innovation related to stormwater capture called a dual pipe supply system. Essentially, water is provided to households and other buildings through two networks, one that uses recycled wastewater, the other that uses harvested stormwater. The point of origin water quality from these two sources can vary, of course, but both are treated to the same standards and have the same end uses. So if they're going to be used in a household or if they're going to be used in commercial structures where there will be human contact, they will be treated to whatever level is required to make them safe for human contact. Let's look at future governance aspirations for both the U.S. and Australia in the use of low-impact developments. We'll start with the United States. A decade and a half ago, the Environmental Protection Agency generated a strategic plan, which was revised just a couple of years ago. And one of the foci of the strategic plan was to suggest changes to the urban environment that could improve the overall health of human beings as well as the health of the natural environment. In the strategic plan, stormwater management was explicitly mentioned as one vehicle that has strong connections to aspects of the built environment. Exactly what we've been talking about in my remarks today. The state of California, and as you know, our state is undergoing a very severe drought, developed a water action plan 3 years ago, which, among other things, encourages stormwater capture and floodplain reconnection projects, as well as potable wastewater reuse to improve the overall health of the environment, to reduce flood stages, and as possible sources for water supply. Notice in here the combination of stormwater capture and its relationship to these other innovations. This is a very important step forward in water governance in California. The goal of this California Water Action Plan is, by collectively bringing these various innovations together, is to make communities resilient against drought and further changes in water supply that are likely to be caused by climate change, by supporting and expanding funding for what are called integrated water management planning and projects. These are projects that recycle wastewater, that capture stormwater, that enhance conservation efforts, all aimed at increasing regional self-reliance, and especially through the use of reused stormwater. The plan also recognized that in order to introduce these innovations, government and governance is going to be extremely important. Means will have to be developed to incentivize, to recognize and reward, and to co-fund, both by the state and by local communities, multi-benefit projects, again, that include stormwater management. What about Australia? It would appear from much of what's been said that maybe Australia doesn't really have to do much more. Not true. In fact, Australia feels they have much more to do in stormwater capture and low-impact development in order to get where they need to be in terms of their future water needs. Beginning in the mid-1990s and continuing through this decade, the Council of Australian Governments has developed a strategic framework for water reforms. And this strategic framework is really focused on governance. How do we develop pricing systems and institutional management systems that encourage sustainability, that encourage consultation with various communities in order to make sure that we continue to introduce and develop and sustain these various innovations. This strategic framework establishes a number of requirements, including specific prescriptions for wastewater management and water quality goals moving forward. In Australia, as in the United States, standards for wastewater treatment and management are becoming more rigorous over time. Water-related research, such as the research we do here at the University of California, is really very important to the kinds of things that the Council of Australian Governments is doing and encouraging. And of course, Australian universities, our partners at Monash and at the University of Melbourne, are doing the kind of water-related research that will feed into this strategic framework. Public consultation and outreach education, education to school children, education to communities, and talking with and conferring with various members of the public is going to be absolutely essential moving forward. In short, the framework promotes innovations in stormwater storage and reuse as a supplement to the existing array of services that already exists in Australia through building public support for changes in urban planning and design. In short, Australia recognizes that the future of low-impact development is going to rely quite heavily on how the built environment is modified to accommodate the capture and the reuse of stormwater. In conclusion, let's look at some future governance challenges that we here in Southern California need to be aware of and that we can learn from the experiences nationally taking place in Australia and in the U.S. Some questions. How easily can these various low-impact development innovations be integrated into the urban landscape at multiple scales? Many of the innovations that we've talked about today and that you've heard about in other presentations regarding low-impact development are done at very small neighborhood scales, some within a single watershed. A question that we need to ask ourselves is, can these innovations be ramped up? Can they be used in larger and larger areas? Can they be transferred from one community to another wholesale? Or do they have to be modified in various ways? Can regulatory frameworks that govern public health and environmental quality be developed that encourage more water substitution and that minimize human health risks, yet at the same time encourage rather than discourage private investment in low-impact developments? Developers are going to require flexibility before they agree to invest in these innovations. They have to be assured that these innovations are going to pass regulatory muster. And as we've seen, there are advantages in some centralized, directed control in terms of the introduction of low-impact development, the standardizing of regulations, the standardizing of health risks, and so forth. But we also need decentralized governance to encourage more innovation, more public engagement. Can these two things be combined? One of the things that we've learned in Australia is that the country has a long tradition of innovation in urban design, innovation, a quest for livability. The city of Melbourne has long been recognized internationally as one of the best planned cities in the world. Can these innovations and their widespread acceptance of water-saving urban features, especially among the upper and middle classes in these communities, can these advantages be exploited and perhaps disseminated elsewhere, including here in California? The role of governmental coordination is very important in thinking about decentralized versus centralized combinations. Again, in Victoria, state as well as federal law encourages local governments and local water agencies, what we would call water utilities, to coordinate their supply projects, their decisions over water allocation and water use. By contrast, it is worth noting that in California, at least until recently, most policy responses to stormwater management, to local flooding, and to pollution tended to be locally driven without much real guidance or direction at a state level. Perhaps this is one of the things that we're beginning to learn from the Australian experience. Finally, in thinking about governance issues in the implementation of low-impact developments, it's good for us to think systematically about how you actually plan and institute low-impact developments. It's important that we develop a conceptual framework to harvest stormwater. And it's important in developing that framework to think about the character of the watershed that we're actually dealing with when we capture stormwater, and the water quality issues that might arise and how to model them so we best understand the challenges they pose. We also have to integrate our analyses with the water management plans of various agencies that govern various aspects of water in communities. We also have to incorporate the responses of social and political communities that are going to be affected by these innovations. And of course, we have to do an economic evaluation to determine how much these innovations might cost and who will pay for them. Last but not least, we need to look at the vulnerability of various human health aspects and environmental aspects from the adoption of low-impact development. Who or what is vulnerable, and can these vulnerabilities be reduced? As we've seen, a great deal of thought is being given to that in governmental regulations over low-impact development. And finally, it's good to have not just a single strategy, but an array of optional strategies. This is one of the things I think that has been done in Melbourne and Victoria, and in Los Angeles under their low-impact development ordinance is designed to do by encouraging low-impact development to work with rather than against communities and their interests. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you've learned something about governance issues and low-impact development.